The sound of the door slamming echoed through the house, signaling the final chapter of their marriage. Rachel stood in front of her husband, Mark, her arms crossed defensively. Her face was hard, a mixture of anger and determination as she spoke the words she had been rehearsing for days. "I want a divorce, Mark. It's over." Mark stood there, frozen. He hadn't expected this, not this way, not so soon. His heart pounded, but his face remained expressionless. He had known about the affair for weeks, but Rachel had no idea. To her, this was just another fight, a petty argument that had reached its breaking point. But for him? It was the end of a long, silent battle he had been fighting in the shadows. Rachel, still stewing in her own anger, didn't see the calmness in his eyes. She didn't notice the slight shift in his posture, the subtle shift from the devastated husband she had come to expect to something colder, more calculated. "What do you mean, it's over?" Mark finally spoke, his voice steady. "I thought you were happy. You got what you wanted, right? You've been seeing him behind my back for months. I'm sure he can give you everything I couldn't." Rachel flinched. The nerve of him, speaking like that, so detached, so calm. This was supposed to be her moment of liberation, the moment where she could finally take control of her life. But something was wrong. Mark wasn't crying. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't even angry. Instead, he was eerily composed, and that sent a chill down her spine. "You know what, Rachel?" Mark said, leaning against the doorframe. "I've been thinking a lot about this. And I've realized something. You've been planning to leave me for months, right? You've already made up your mind. But I've been planning something too." Rachel's confusion deepened. "What are you talking about?" With a slight smirk, Mark took a step closer. "You're right about one thing. It is over. But not in the way you think." Mark sat in the dimly lit living room, the weight of the last few days pressing down on his chest. He could hear Rachel moving around upstairs, getting ready to confront him. The tension between them had been building for months, but neither of them had spoken about it directly, not until now. Their marriage had once been something special. At least, that's how Mark remembered it. Back when they were both in their early 20s, full of dreams and love, their life together felt like a promise. They had married young, and despite the odds, they made it through the early years of struggles, pushing through the financial issues, the job losses, the moves, and the inevitable disagreements. Still, they had made it through, always telling themselves that this was just a rough patch. But, over time, the connection began to fade. Their conversations turned into mundane exchanges about bills, chores, and obligations. Intimacy became a distant memory, and Rachel's once vibrant personality grew more distant. Mark tried to keep up, tried to revive what was slowly slipping away, but his efforts seemed futile. Every attempt felt forced, like he was clinging to something that was already gone. Then came the whispers. Mark first noticed the signs of her infidelity about 3 months ago. It was small at first: missed phone calls, unexplained late nights at work, and a general sense that Rachel wasn't as present as she used to be. He dismissed it at first, telling himself that maybe she was just overwhelmed with the pressures of her job. But the nagging doubts refused to leave him alone. One night, while Rachel was in the shower, Mark picked up her phone. She had left it on the kitchen counter, buzzing incessantly. The message preview on the lock screen caught his eye: "I can't wait to see you tonight." His heart dropped. He tried to tell himself it was harmless, a simple flirtation. But the sickening knot in his stomach told him otherwise. Rachel had always been the more outgoing one in their relationship. She loved attention, always seeking validation from friends and strangers alike. But this was different. This wasn't the harmless flirtation he had known her to engage in, it was something deeper. The messages became more frequent, more intimate. And the name attached to them was always the same: Tom. Tom was a colleague of Rachel's. Mark didn't know much about him, just that he had started working at the same company as Rachel about a year ago. They had met at a couple of work functions, and Mark had always gotten a bad feeling about him. Tom had that charm, that way about him that made it clear he was always looking for his next opportunity. It didn't take long for Mark to notice the way Tom looked at Rachel. The smiles, the lingering touches, the way his gaze would follow her every movement. It made Mark uncomfortable, but he had brushed it off. That was until now. A few weeks after his discovery, Mark had followed Rachel one evening after work. He had told her he was going to meet some friends for drinks, and she had left for what she thought was a quiet evening alone at home. Instead, Mark drove across town, keeping his distance but close enough to see her. He watched her enter a bar, a place they used to frequent together. Inside, he saw her sitting at a table, laughing with Tom. His heart clenched as he saw them touch, her hand brushing his arm, their laughter a little too intimate. Mark had always prided himself on being the observant type, calm, collected, the kind of person who could handle any situation with grace. But seeing Rachel with Tom felt like a punch to the gut. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. He watched them leave the bar together, and his world crashed around him. He couldn't let her know that he knew, at least, not yet. He needed to gather his thoughts, plan his next move. The next day, he pretended like everything was normal. Rachel had returned home late that night, and she was tired. She explained her evening with Tom as just a catching up with a friend moment. Mark didn't say anything. He didn't confront her. Instead, he let the silence settle in between them. He could feel it then, the disconnect, the wall that had slowly but surely built up between them. His mind raced, torn between the betrayal he felt and the reality that their marriage had been teetering on the edge for far too long. He had allowed it to happen, and now it was too late. For the next few weeks, Mark went through the motions. He worked long hours, coming home to an empty house. Rachel was always busy or tired when he tried to reach out, and he began to see just how far apart they had drifted. She no longer hid her distance from him. It was as if the affair had pulled back the curtain, revealing the emptiness that had always been there, just beneath the surface. The emotional abandonment had begun long before the affair. It was only now that he could clearly see it. Mark had tried to talk to Rachel about their marriage on several occasions, but each conversation was met with excuses, distractions, or outright indifference. Every attempt to reconnect had been futile. He knew what was happening, but he didn't have the courage to face it until now. As he sat in the living room, awaiting Rachel's confrontation, Mark's mind raced. He had spent weeks processing the betrayal, wrestling with his emotions, and contemplating his options. The hardest part wasn't knowing that she had cheated, it was knowing that their marriage had been broken long before she ever slept with another man. The affair, while devastating, was only the final nail in the coffin. It was the confirmation of everything he had been feeling for so long. He had planned his next move carefully. Mark had known that Rachel was planning to ask for a divorce. She had already made up her mind, and she thought it was her decision to make. But Mark wasn't going to let her control this narrative. She wasn't going to walk away unscathed. The door creaked open, and Rachel appeared at the top of the stairs. Her face was flushed, her eyes sharp with the edge of determination. She had practiced this moment in her mind, telling herself that she was finally taking control. As she descended the stairs, her eyes met Mark's, and for a brief moment, he saw the guilt flash in her expression. But it quickly disappeared, replaced by the mask of a woman who had made up her mind. "I'm done, Mark," she said, her voice steady, though her words held a finality that sent a shiver through him. "I've been unhappy for a long time, and I'm not going to stay in this dead-end marriage. I'm asking for a divorce." Mark nodded slowly, his face expressionless. He hadn't expected her to do it so bluntly, so decisively. But this was Rachel, always the one to take control, always the one to push things to their breaking point. "I understand," he said softly, his voice betraying no emotion. "But I need to tell you something too." Rachel raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard by his response. "What's that?" Mark stood up, his calm demeanor never faltering. "I've been planning for this moment too, Rachel. I knew what was going on. I knew about Tom. And I've already made preparations for my future." Her eyes widened slightly, but she quickly masked her shock with a scoff. "You think you can intimidate me with this? I'm the one leaving, Mark." Mark didn't react. He simply smiled, a small, almost sad smile. "You've got it all wrong. It's not about intimidation. It's about something much more important. It's about me being in control of my life for the first time in a long time. And that's exactly what I'm going to do now." He turned and walked towards the door, leaving Rachel standing there, her world unraveling faster than she could comprehend. Rachel stood frozen in the middle of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. Mark's words hung in the air, thick with tension. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. She had expected anger, perhaps even pleading, but what Mark had said, what he had just revealed, was something entirely different. It was as if the man she had married, the man she thought she knew, was now a complete stranger. "You've been planning this?" she asked, her voice shaky, unsure if she was even ready for the answer. Mark didn't look at her. Instead, he walked over to the kitchen counter and grabbed his phone. He tapped a few keys, then turned the screen toward her. Rachel's eyes narrowed as she saw the image, a text thread between Mark and his lawyer, a series of messages dating back weeks. There were documents attached, contracts, agreements, everything she could have imagined, all laying the groundwork for what was now happening before her eyes. "I've been preparing for this for a while, Rachel. You think you're the only one who can make decisions?" Mark's voice was cold now, the calmness that had marked his previous words turning into something more forceful, more determined. "You walked away from this marriage long before you physically left me. You emotionally checked out months ago. And I've known." Rachel's breath hitched as the reality began to sink in. All this time, she had been the one in control. She had been the one making the moves, deciding when and how she'd end the marriage. But now Mark was flipping the script, and the realization hit her with an almost physical blow. How had he known? Had he been watching her? Did he suspect? Her mind raced, but Mark continued, barely noticing her stunned silence. "I knew the moment Tom started texting you all the time. The moment you started staying late at the office and coming home late with excuses. I could feel it, Rachel. The distance. And you didn't even try to hide it," he said, his words sharp, each one a dagger. "But it wasn't about that. It wasn't about the affair, not really. It was about what you took from me long before you ever slept with him." Rachel's face reddened, a mix of shame and anger rising within her. She tried to steady her breath, but the guilt clawed at her. She wanted to lash out, to defend herself, but somehow, the words felt hollow in her throat. Mark's expression softened, though the edge in his voice never left. "I thought I could fix it, Rachel. I tried. I really did. I even went to counseling by myself. But there was nothing to fix. You were already gone." Rachel blinked back the sting of tears, but she didn't let them fall. This wasn't the time for that. She was angry now, furious at the way Mark was so composed, as if everything about her actions, her betrayal, meant nothing to him. It was as if he had already moved on, but she hadn't. And the realization hit her like a freight train. While she had been out with Tom, planning her escape, Mark had been planning his own life, too. "You've already moved on, haven't you?" She spat, her voice full of venom. "You've been seeing someone else, haven't you? Or at least, you're going to. That's why you're so calm. You think you can just replace me with someone new, don't you?" Mark finally turned to face her. His gaze was piercing, but there was something else there, something deeper, something Rachel hadn't seen before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't betrayal. It was something colder, something that sent a chill through her veins. "You're right about one thing," he said slowly, his words measured. "I have already moved on. But not in the way you think. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. The way he said it, it sounded like he was talking about something bigger than just another affair, another rebound. This wasn't just about his anger or his hurt. This was about his future. Mark took a deep breath, walking over to a drawer in the corner of the kitchen and pulling something out. He unfolded a piece of paper, a document. He handed it to Rachel, and her hands trembled as she looked down at the contents. It was a prenuptial agreement, one that neither of them had ever signed. Remember when we first got married? You never wanted to talk about money. You thought it was all about love. Well, I did some things behind the scenes, Rachel. Things you didn't know about. Rachel's gaze flicked back up to his face, searching for some explanation. What do you mean? Mark sighed. We never talked about it because you never wanted to. But while you were off living your life with Tom, I made sure I was taking care of mine. I've been preparing for this moment, and now that it's here, you won't walk away with everything like you think you will. Rachel's heart dropped as the meaning behind his words hit her full force. Mark had been planning to leave her, too. He wasn't just planning for the divorce. He had already set things in motion, financially and legally, in a way that left her with nothing. The weight of it suffocated her. He had been playing a long game, and she had only just realized it. But then, there was one last thing. Mark stepped toward her and placed a small envelope in her hands. Rachel opened it, and inside was a letter addressed to her. As she read the first few lines, her chest tightened. The letter wasn't just about the divorce. It was about the end of their entire relationship. I don't hate you, Rachel. I don't even feel angry anymore. But you need to know this, while you were out with Tom, I was building a life for myself. I wasn't going to let you destroy my future with your betrayal. So I did what I had to do. He paused before finishing. You wanted a divorce. You wanted freedom. Now you have it. But understand this, Rachel, freedom doesn't always come with the consequences you expect. Rachel looked up at him, her face pale, her hands shaking. The truth, the full weight of what Mark had been doing, came crashing down on her. The reality was far worse than she had imagined. It wasn't just that he had planned for the divorce, he had planned for his own freedom in a way that left her stranded. She had thought she was the one in control, but Mark had already taken that from her, silently, patiently, and with a coldness she had never expected. As she stood there, staring at the letter in her hands, the silence between them grew louder. Mark had already moved on. And Rachel was left standing at the crossroads of her own decisions, with nothing but the wreckage of what had once been. The bombshell had been dropped, and now Rachel had to live with the consequences. Rachel stood there, the letter still clutched in her hands, staring at the words that seemed to burn into her mind. She had wanted to be free, wanted the control she thought she had over her life, her marriage. But now, as the weight of Mark's actions sank deeper into her consciousness, she realized just how wrong she had been. Mark had played his hand so expertly, with a calmness that had been absent in their relationship for so long. He hadn't been waiting for her to make the first move. He had made his decision before she even realized what was happening. His life had already started anew, and in a cruel twist of fate, Rachel was left standing in the ashes of a life that was no longer hers to claim. As the minutes ticked by, Rachel's mind raced. Could she have known? Could she have felt it? Was it really too late to fix anything? The truth hit her harder than the affair itself. The affair, while painful, had been just a symptom of a much deeper issue. The emotional abandonment. The months of distance. The constant feeling of being alone, even when they were in the same room. I didn't think it would come to this, she said quietly, her voice shaking. She wasn't sure if she was talking to Mark or to herself. I thought we could fix it. But I guess I was wrong. Mark didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any words he could have said. He had already made his point, and the realization of it was settling in for Rachel. She wasn't just dealing with a betrayal, She was dealing with the end of everything she had known, her marriage, her future, her identity as a wife. It was all slipping away, and no amount of anger or regret could change that now. Mark took a step back, allowing the space between them to grow. "You made your choices, Rachel," he said quietly, though his tone was devoid of malice. "I wasn't the perfect husband. I know that. But I gave you everything I had, even when you stopped giving me the same. And that's where we are now." Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? What could she do? She had already torn their lives apart with one reckless decision after another. She had left him for someone else, thinking she could escape the confines of her marriage, thinking she could find happiness outside of what they had built together. And yet, here she was, worse off than she had ever been. Her mind flitted back to the moments before Mark's bombshell, before she had learned the full scope of his preparations. She had walked in thinking she could declare her freedom, demand her own path. But Mark had been prepared. He had anticipated her every move, waiting for the moment when she would finally slip and expose her hand. And when that moment came, he didn't fight back the way she expected. He didn't beg for her to stay. Instead, he offered her the bitter truth: there was nothing left for her here, because he had already moved on, in ways she couldn't possibly understand. For the first time in their entire relationship, Rachel felt utterly powerless. She had been so sure of herself, so convinced that her choices were justified. But now, standing here, her future uncertain, she realized that Mark's silent strength had been the thing that had truly broken her. "You're right," she whispered after a long pause. I've made mistakes. But I thought I was the one who was suffering. I thought I was the one who needed to be free." Mark looked at her for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. "We all suffer in our own way, Rachel. But you have to realize, freedom isn't always what you think it is. It doesn't come without consequences." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she wiped them away quickly. She wasn't going to break down in front of him, not now. She had already done enough damage. But the truth was, she didn't know what came next. Was she supposed to feel relief? Anger? Regret? Or was this just the beginning of a long road of self-realization and painful growth? "I never thought it would end like this," she said softly, more to herself than to Mark. "But now, I'm not so sure I can blame you. I don't even know who I am anymore." Mark nodded, his expression softening just a little. "I'm not asking you to blame anyone. This is the result of our choices, Rachel. You've made yours. Now I'm making mine. And maybe, in time, you'll figure out what you need to do with yours too." With that, Mark turned and walked toward the door. Rachel stood motionless, unsure of what she was feeling. A part of her wanted to run after him, to beg him to stay, to somehow fix everything. But she knew deep down that it was too late for that. She had already burned the bridges she needed to cross. All she could do now was face the truth of her actions, and their consequences. Mark paused by the door, looking back at her one final time. "Goodbye, Rachel," he said softly, almost regretfully, before he stepped out, leaving her standing in the house they had once shared. As the door closed behind him, the silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the end she had imagined, but it was the end nonetheless. And now, as the weight of everything pressed down on her, Rachel realized the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be a quick fix, a simple apology, or a happy ending. It was going to be hard, painful, and long. But it was hers to face. She couldn't run from it anymore. The door closed, and with it, the life she had once known. As the screen faded to black, the question lingered: what happens when the person who was left behind becomes the one who leaves the past behind? Was Rachel's journey truly just beginning? Or had the final curtain already fallen on a marriage long lost? Only time would tell.